Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me a truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. The Names Not Numbers Oral History Film Documentary Project is remembering the stories of the Holocaust and is telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance. This unique project is in its 16th year. Over 2,500 survivors and 6,000 students have participated in it worldwide. The students were instructed by teachers and professionals. They learned interviewing techniques from journalists. They learned filming techniques and editing skills from documentary filmmakers. The students interviewed, filmed, and edited the 2-hour interviews with each survivor to make 20-minute oral histories that are compiled in the Names Not Numbers documentary at the school. You're about to view the documentary Names Not Numbers, a movie in the making. This film chronicles the students as they are being trained by the professionals and includes their reflections. In it is embedded approximately 10 minutes from each interview. This is the students' work. They're filmed and edited interviews. Through this project, our students are preserving history, and they are the witnesses to the witnesses.
I really didn't understand what was going on in either case. And I don't think anybody really understood the horror of the situation.
In my eyes, knowing, I know all about the Holocaust and what happened in Germany. I never thought about it that way, that you would be in denial because you're afraid of leaving instead of being afraid of staying.
I decided to do this project because no one in my family comes from a Jewish background and it's never really talked about. I just wanted to talk to a survivor one-on-one.
I had no control, I had no power to do anything about it. We couldn't rely on the authorities either.
At one point, there's not going to be someone there to tell their stories in person. So this is a way to keep a memory of their thoughts and what they had to say about what they experienced.
I was really enthusiastic to take this project this year. Having now, established this group of people who you have committed yourself to sort of be in this class, most of you as seniors, this curriculum is such a meaningful curriculum that it really, to my mind, is the best thing that I can offer you in terms of not just getting information, but being a part of the process of making Never Again as much of a reality as we can. My first thought is that too often students are just passive participants. This isn't really like that in that it asks you to be making connections between what you're learning and what you're hoping for the future.
Today, 75 years after the end of the Holocaust, 31% of all Americans believe that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Among young Americans, 66% of them could not identify Auschwitz as a concentration camp or death camp.
Not knowing about something happening is one thing, but knowing about something happening but kind of not understanding the gravity of it, that I think is almost more dangerous.
This is the last generation that has the privilege to hear the survivors' testimonies firsthand.
As the last witnesses to these witnesses, you are starting to be a vital link between this older generation and our generation and the generation that's going to come after us. You will be able to inform kids and adults in the future about what you have witnessed and come to believe. You are coming to understand that it isn't enough just to say never again, but that in order to mean that, we have to act against hatred.
We also watched a 16-minute film. It was an interview of Holocaust survivor Fran Malkin. The interview was devastating. I mean, some of the stories she told really hit hard. I kind of thought about my own family. You know, what would I have done in that situation? Or what would my family have done in that situation?
In addition, when living history becomes a memory, it will be you, the students who participated in Names Not Numbers. Through your documentary, you will remember the days of old. The survivors and the students are telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance.
You're doing this, you're gonna realize that these people are telling a story. To say this nicely, like, you're not the most important person in the room. Like, your job as an interviewer is to sit back and absorb what they're saying and just reflect on what they're saying to you. And it helps you become a better listener.
Like, I knew that I had just become another witness to the stories that this person can share, and I know that I'll be able to learn from my survivor's experience and be able to apply it.
If the goal is to try to create that more democratic society, create a passionate, engaged citizenry, this project and trying to share these stories with students in a first-hand way is meaningful.
We're coming off the heels of this big pandemic, and I think that, you know, to find a way to show that, like, the perseverance back then can be like an inspirational bridge to the perseverance now, that was a good way of relating it to us.
This morning we went over some film techniques. Like, I've used cameras before, but nothing as technical as this.
So the first thing we're going to talk about now today with using the cameras is something called the rule of thirds. Okay, and basically what that means is that if you take a frame, so let's take this for example, and you imagine dividing it up into 3 parts. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, just imagine 2 lines. What it's saying basically is if you put your subject not right in the center, but more off to the side. Let's say, for example, maybe this sort of stand for the speaker, and not the most interesting subject in the world, but it's kind of like following, adhering to the rule of thirds, where it's like you have it more off to the third.
Prior to the interview, we learned a few techniques that honestly I had no idea about, how to move the cameras around. Honestly, it was a very big help as I don't know anything about cameras, and I was super scared of either getting the wrong shot, of messing up the interview, like I'm sure a lot of people were.
We just practiced asking each other questions back and forth, and it went swell.
We got to learn how to actually do angles, the best angles for it, how to work the sound best so it stays good for the whole movie. Barak taught us some useful things. He helped us during the whole process too, so we weren't too unfamiliar with it, and it wasn't too complex for us to understand. It was actually kind of fun.
We're about to interview Laszlo Selly,
Eric Lippitz,
Zoe Blau,
Doing Dr. Miriam Klein-Kasanoff,
Alan Hall. It was more kind of surreal for me.
I'm a little nervous, honestly. I've never really experienced anything like this. Really excited to know the story and know how it really was for them.
I would hate for him to get sad or angry over a question and get like flashbacks or something that'll trigger a memory.
But when you speak to someone who went through those experiences and who lived it, it's a very, very different feeling and a very different experience from what you learn in textbooks versus speaking to someone who's flesh and blood.
Hi, Mr. Hall. My name is Ria. I'm going to start off with the interview. So first of all, how are you doing today?
Doing just great.
I wanted to let you know that we really do appreciate you coming here once again. It really means a lot to us.
This place is my home.
What is your name?
Well, that sounds like a very simple question, but it truly is not. I've had many names. My current name, and for the last 60 years or so, it's Alan Hall. I came to the United States with the name of Adam Horsky. My birth name is Adam Horowitz. I was born in Krakow, Poland in 1935, April of 1935.
My name is Zoltán Blau, and I was born in Hungary, December 17, 1930.
My name is Eric Lippitz, and I was born in Antwerp, Belgium.
And what year were you born?
1936.
My name is László Szeli, and I was born in Budapest, Hungary, on December the 31st, 1937. When I was born, my name was Schwarz, and my father changed the family name after the Holocaust because anti-Semitism was still running rampant in Hungary, and he felt that my twin brother and I will have a better chance in life, not advertising our Jewishness.
My name is Miriam Klein Kasanov. I was born in Košice, Czechoslovakia, known as Slovakia at that time. I was born either in 1936 or 1937. I don't know for sure because I don't have a birth certificate, but a child survivor is those of us who were under the age of 9 or 10. We have different kind of memories than our older brothers and sister survivors who we revere very much.
At the time, did you recognize that you were Jewish?
I knew that we were Jewish because we had Shabbat evening services, and this was something very special. My father coming home from the synagogue, and my grandfather, and the singing and the traditions and the challah and the candle lighting and so forth, yes.
We were 7 siblings. I was the second youngest one, but as a small child, remembering going to public school from 1st grade to the 6th grade, and the first 4 or 5 years was fairly normal.
We had a very normal middle-class life, I guess you would say. My oldest brother, who was 4 years older than me, he was going to school, and I always looked forward to him coming home and telling me stories about school. My father used to take me for rides on his bicycle and played in the garden. It was a nice life as far as back as I can remember.
When was the first time you ever experienced anti-Semitism?
Never experienced any anti-Semitism until a few days or a few weeks prior to the start of World War II.
I also remember my dad talking about somebody in Germany causing a lot of problems, and he said, you know, he said, I think we're going to have a war, and we're going to have to find a way to escape Belgium.
The nations who were allies with Germany, they all adopted laws against restricting Jewish movement, not to have certain businesses.
Really, my very first recollection as a young child is my mother sitting in our living room and sewing yellow stars on our clothes. My father had a little business. He was working with 3, maybe 4 people. And when the Jewish laws came into effect, well, of course, one of them was that Jews cannot own businesses. So he had to hand the business over to one of his old trusted employees. And the man took the business over and immediately fired my father, stating that he will not employ Jews.
Almost on a daily basis, coming home from school or going to school, bigger, teenage kids who are making remarks and even sometimes physically attacking us.
In my building, there was a little girl about the same age as I, and we were both about 4.5, 5 years old. And we were always in each other's apartments playing together. As far as I can remember, we were the only 2 children that age. And then just before the war started, her mother looked at me in a very harsh way and said, "Hey, you Jew, get out of my apartment and don't ever come back." I had no idea what she was talking about. I mean, I knew I was Jewish, but she called me a dirty Jew, and I know I was not dirty. So I was puzzled, and she told me, repeated, to get out of her apartment. I left and went upstairs to our apartment, and my mother, of course, knew immediately what that was about.
Jews cannot live wherever they want to. They have to move into a ghetto. They simply took a big apartment building, painted a big yellow star on the front gate. That became a designated Jewish house, and Jews had to move in there whether they had an apartment or not. The only thing that we could carry is what we could hold in our 2 hands. And we were little kids. How much could we carry? We had our pillows and our blankets, and my parents couldn't carry too much else either. As we left our apartments, we looked back and we saw our neighbors rushing in, grabbing whatever they wanted, and there was nothing that we could do about that.
My parents were out for the evening, and I was with my 2 brothers in a room. I was sound asleep, and I woke up because the house was shaking, and I jumped into my brother's bed. I remember holding on to him, and he was holding me. But it wasn't long before my parents came in, completely disheveled, and they said to us, "Get dressed quickly, get dressed quickly. There's a war on, and we have to escape immediately." My father decided the only way we're going to get through to other countries is by diamonds. He put it in a safe deposit box at the bank. But I was told my mother called all the rest of the family that was in Belgium at the time, Lapin, and we made a convoy of cars trying to escape to Marseille or wherever we could. There were probably hundreds and hundreds of cars on the road, and the Luftwaffe was strafing them. I think at a couple of points we had to jump out of the cars, and we were lying in ditches, and my father lying on top of me. And when I talk about it, I can taste it. I can taste the sand in my mouth. And I remember hearing screaming. Cars were on fire. People were lying on the road. They were crying and bleeding, and a lot of dead people. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder how they put the legs back together. How they put the arms back? And why aren't they talking?
Do you have any specific memories of the Germans invading?
From my point of view, they invaded twice. Because one time in 1939, they invaded, and we walked out, literally walked out of Krakow because there was no public or private transportation available. We walked 200 miles, then arrived in my dad's hometown, and fortunately, that was in the Soviet zone. By doing that, we gained 20 months worth of life. When the Nazis attacked a second time, I remember actually seeing a woman get shot on the street.
Do you remember how old you were at that time?
1941, I was 6 and a half.
Can you tell us what you were feeling when you were caught by the German soldiers?
I was on the back of the truck, and I heard it crying and screaming because they went into the buildings all around us, all up and down the street, and literally wrestled the children away from their parents. And you can imagine the emotion of these adults when their children were being wrestled away from them. When we left Poland, we were not thinking about what to bring. My mother only she had the presence of mind of taking a stroller for me, which was very helpful. Underneath that stroller, she stuffed in her fur coat because that was the most expensive thing that she owned. Also the family chest of silver because that's the most expensive thing the family had, and a family album. And that's the only things that we saved from before the war. Subsequently, my dad met a Nazi who had a 2-room suite of offices in the tallest building in Poland. The top 2 floors were occupied by the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force. And he was complaining that he had to pay rent. And my dad, without acting too excited, said, well, I think I can use that space. And so he sublet it. And in that space for the next 2 years, my mother and I hid in a closet off the private office. We only had 4 things. Each of us had a pillow on our lap. We never sat on those pillows. And the pillow was there. If we had to cough, sneeze, anything, we would bury our head in the pillow. We had a potty so that if we had to relieve ourselves, we could. And the only other thing that we had was a little piece of baker's string. We would play cat in the cradle hour after hour after hour, because that's all we could do. And for 2 years, nobody ever looked inside the closet.
My father kept trying to tell my mother early on that he knew things were getting bad for the Jewish community in Košice, and that he had been reading American newspapers that were sent to him by one of my mother's sisters who lived in Chicago. And she had already sent my father paperwork, passage for a ship that she knew was leaving. and begged him to convince my mother to please get out and leave while we could, and my mother wouldn't. Probably my strongest memory is that one Shabbat, the Hungarian Nazi police came in and took my father away to a local Hungarian Nazi labor camp. My dad escaped from that camp, and he came home and he said to my mother basically, so this is it. We either take Aunt Bessie's paperwork and we make our way across Eastern Europe to Portugal, or if I'm caught and they will come get me, they're going to murder all the Jews of Europe, and make your choice. Well, Lily didn't make it. This is how identical they were. I can't even tell you which one is my mother. And she said, we have to leave. We have papers. Come with us. And my Aunt Lily said, are you crazy? I'm not running throughout Europe from something that I don't even know is going to happen. And the tragedy of that is that we survived and they did not. We have never found Aunt Lily, her husband, or the two little girls. For all I know, her two little girls are grown women my age wandering the world and don't even know that I exist.
The Hungarian police showed up and they told us that you have 20 minutes to pack your bags, and you have to go to the town square, to assemble in town square, and then they took us into a ghetto. We were taken by horse and buggy because our town didn't have the railroad station. So the town that we were taken to the ghetto was named Beregszáz. It was a brick factory. We had to hang up bed sheets to separate one family from the other one to have some privacy, and it was cold, and it was terrible condition, terrible conditions. And that we spent approximately 3 weeks under those conditions.
The deportations started and they herded the people out of these buildings. They lined them up on the streets. They had clubs, they had whips, they had big snarling dogs, and of course they had guns. And they marched the people down to the railroad station where they shoved them into cattle cars, no passenger cars for the Jews, only cattle cars. They took them to the camps, and then you know what happened there. The Nazis came to our building, knocked on the door, or actually banged on the door, it was knocking, and they shoved in another 4, 5 families. Old men, old ladies, pregnant ladies, mothers with small children, just a whole bunch of people. We had lice in our hair, we had roaches, we had mice. The rats were not too far behind. And then what I think is the very worst, we had bed bugs. And they itched like mad, and tried to tell a little kid not to scratch with his filthy, dirty hands. That's impossible. So you get sick, you get infections. There's no doctor, there's no medicine, there's no hospital, and there's no emergency room. If you live, you live. And if you die, well, then there's just one less Jew in the world. They did not care. Money was almost non-existent. The only way you could buy something to eat is by bartering. But when that ran out, then you had nothing. But we had an aunt, and really she was not an aunt. She was only a family friend. She was a member of the Nazi Party. And she came to us one day and she told my parents that she will take my twin brother and me to her place to see if she could save us. And we were warned never ever to tell anybody our real name. She had a little tobacco shop, a little tiny hole in the wall. And she lived behind this shop in a dark, dingy room. She had a young woman working for her. And this young woman was very suspicious and felt that something is not right. And she kept asking us for our real name. And I would never tell her, or we would never tell her. But one day, she came to me with a piece of candy. And she told me I can have this candy if I tell her my real name. And let me tell you, I wanted that candy. I wanted real bad. And what did I know? I was a little kid. I told her. My aunt overheard this from behind the curtain, ran out like a mad woman, fired the girl, threw her out of there immediately. And within 5 minutes, we were on our way back to the designated Jewish house and perhaps to wait for the deportation.
We had to get to Portugal. We made it to near the Spanish border, and it was at that time my father realized, oh my goodness, I left the diamonds in a safe deposit box in Antwerp. And he said, we're not going anywhere unless we can bribe our way out. Went back to our house in Antwerp, but he took my brother with him, my oldest brother, and they went right into the heart of Antwerp. He got off the bus with my brother, and there were some soldiers looking at him, and he walked right up to them, Nazi soldiers, and in perfect German, my father spoke quite a few languages, he said, Guten Tag, good day, I'm glad you're here, perhaps we'll have some order in Belgium now, and welcome, and I hope we'll see more of you. And with that, he took my brother, went into the bank, went downstairs where the safe deposit boxes were, got out the diamonds, and walked out again. As he walked out, he saw some Gestapo agents, and again, they were eyeing him up and down. So he did the smart thing all over again. He walked right up to them and, Guten Tag, how are you, and this and that. And said, is there going to be a Wagner concert in Berlin this year? He tried to keep it short, but he said, I've got to get my little one back to the house because he's hungry. So I'm going to go and give him get him some food. And with that, he walked off, got back on a bus, so I'm not quite sure exactly what the transportation was. But we made it to the Spanish border, and leaving a few diamonds with the soldiers there, they let us through. But they wouldn't let my father through. And he spoke to his brother, and his brother said, go to Morocco and stay at some hotel. I don't know, he told him the name. He said, I will be in touch with you there. By the third or fourth cable, please come immediately. The children are very ill. We got an answer, and the consulate got an answer saying, we're allowing Mr. Lippitz to travel on a compassionate basis. And at that point, we were told that there's a train going to Portugal from where we were. And we were given tickets. My uncle in America had arranged everything. We get on the train, was packed. It was worse than a rush hour in a New York City subway. We stopped not far from the dock where the Siboney was.
They marched us to the railroad station, and then they put us on the cattle cars, and it was 2 or 2.5 days. I don't know if it was 85 or 90 or 95 people. No room to sit down practically, and the air was two openings in that cattle car, very little air for that many people. And it was the smell and the fear, especially at night. We heard all kind of rifle fire, machine gun fire, so very, very frightening. We were taken to Birkenau, which was the railroad station for Auschwitz. SS soldiers were right there with their dogs in their clubs, and somebody approached my mother, a person that worked at the railroad station. He asked my mother how old I was, And my mother said that he's 13 years old, he was just bar mitzvah. And he said that I should leave the children's and women's line and go to the men's line. And if somebody is gonna ask me how old I am, I should say I'm 18 years old. But the line of the men's line was moving already, so I couldn't find my father. The Nazi officer asked me how old I am. I was afraid to say I'm 18. I said I'm 16. So they told me to go. At that point, I didn't know it was right or left. And that was the line for the living. And the other line was straight to the gas chamber. I was tattooed in Auschwitz, and my number is 83913. They placed us in a barrack, maybe 1,000 people, newcomers. We still didn't know what was going on. They told us we should tell the commander of the barrack the real story, that we are really 13 years old and we would like to go to reunite with our parents. And he took us by our hands outside of the barrack and he pointed to the chimney, and the chimney was in full blaze, and he told us the full story, what was going on. The only thing to look forward is from now on to try to survive. And I only spent 3 or 4 days in Auschwitz, and from there they marched us off, maybe 10 miles, a satellite camp to Auschwitz. Then this was a coal mining labor camp.
We were running and hiding to get away from anti-Semites who were gathering Jewish men in our community and putting them into work labor concentration type camps. That's all we knew at that time. Where we had a goal to escape Eastern Europe, Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe. And our goal was to get from Slovakia all the way over to Lisbon, Portugal. So why Lisbon, Portugal? Because in 1940 and 41, there were ships that had been contracted by a New York City rescue organization called the Hayas that was sending ships over to Lisbon, if you could get to Lisbon, to get to freedom. So we were running and hiding throughout 7 different countries. When we finally did get to Lisbon, Portugal, 7 or 8 months later, we were put in where they put the refugees. And it was a little bit outside of Lisbon, which meant that my dad and mom had to go into Lisbon every day to the consul's office to see the status of when the ship was going to come in that was going to take us to freedom. So they left me alone. With a 9-month-old baby, my brother. And I think that there was an awareness at that time that I had a huge responsibility of having to take care of this baby child. Our ship did come on May 15th, the Ciudad de Seville, and we did arrive in New York and New Jersey harbors on June 14th, 1941. And then my life in America began after that.
It's 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and we're landing in New York. And there it was. We saw a light, and we saw the most beautiful woman you ever want to see, and she's holding a torch. We escaped from the eye of the storm. We actually escaped the Nazis. And here we are in this interrogation room, and they asked a few questions, looked at our passports, and one of them says to my parents, "I'm sorry to tell you, you can't stay in America. We're going to have to send you back to Belgium." My father turned red, my mother starts crying, and he said, "I'm going to get you a visa to go to Manila, the Philippines." And we got a little apartment, and my father started doing some work. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, my father was very, very upset about this, like we all were. Japanese came in, they rounded us all up, and they brought us to a place called Santa Tomas, and they turned it into a prisoner of war camp. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people from all different countries were there. A Japanese soldier comes in, calls out my father's name, and he goes out there. Japanese officer said, "Look, we know who you are now, and we know that you are from Belgium, but as far as we're concerned, you are an enemy alien. Because you are in the bristle business, we're going to give you a chance at your freedom." He said, "You know bristles very well. We need people to clean the Japanese rifles, to clean the heavy equipment, and you hire 40, 50 Filipinos to work for you, and we will let you go." After my father went to them, and he thought he was going to have a fight in his hands, they were smiling at him and waving to him to come over. And they told him, "We are going to have a war with Japan, our own private war. Filipino, we're all guerrillas, and we have a lot more in the mountains, and we're going to attack the Japanese wherever we can. How can you help us?" And my father told them, "Boy, this is terrific." He said, "Give me 50 of your people, Filipinos, who we can really trust, where I can teach them how to clean the rifles, but they will do it. I will show them not to make the bristles in the bar too tight. So if they're loose, eventually they're going to clog the rifle, and when the Japanese soldiers shoot, it will either blow up in their face or it just won't work." That was the beginning of a wonderful friendship between the Filipino people and my family, especially with my dad. It was only a few days later, I was sitting with my mother in the outdoor kitchen that they had there. And I hear the gate at the front opening, and I said, "Papaisi, Papaisi." Who walks in? A Japanese soldier, drunk as a skunk with his rifle and his bayonet. And he looks at my mother, and my mother says to me in French, "Whatever happens, whatever he tries to do, don't cry." He goes to my mother, he goes to grab her, and she turns around, she has a hot iron, and she puts it right by his face, an inch from his face, and he jumps backwards, and he tells her to put it down, and she shakes her head, "No, no." So he comes back to me, and my mother keeps saying, "Don't, whatever happens, don't cry, don't cry, you be strong now, be brave." And he tried to push me away again, kept pushing at me, and then he went back to my mother, it was the same thing. Finally, he was so drunk that he stumbled out of where we were and he left. I don't know what happened to him. I never had so much hate in my heart, such a desire to kill somebody, to put a knife in him if there was one just near us. My father came home, and my mother told him what happened, and he said, "You know what? It's a good thing I wasn't here, because I would have killed him, and then what? What will we do with the body? Where do we hide it?"
We survived by not being noticed. obviously a baby and a baby crying, etc. Everybody notices that. And so I thought that his birth was going to be my death. However, I was absolutely wrong, because what happened was, when the Nazis regained control of Warsaw, they essentially destroyed the Polish resistance. And the only way you could leave Warsaw at that time is through checkpoints. And in these checkpoints, if your papers weren't right, you get shot right on the spot. We had no papers. We didn't, as far as the Nazis were concerned, we didn't exist. A physician trying to save the baby, this miraculous, less than 2-pound baby, born when no other children were being born, put us on a hospital train, and I tagged along. We were taken, the train went to Krakow, the very place where we started.
As soon as the Russian army started to very aggressively attacking the German forces, the Germans decided that they still want to have forced labor, and they were driving the prisoners further from Poland into Germany. The reason they call it Death March, because anybody that could not keep up with the march was shot on the roadside. It was very bitter winter time, and we had snow. That's about the only thing we had. At least we had water to sustain us, because we ate the fresh fallen snow from the ground. We didn't know at that point that they're going to put us on a train, and they will take us 600 or 700 miles into Germany, away from the Russian advancing forces. And it was also in a way lucky, because it was snowing, so we had water. And that was one thing I don't remember if I spent 3 days or 4 days or 5 days on that railroad trip. But anyway, we arrived to Buchenwald, and you had to go through the process of showering. And once we heard shower and process of the disinfection, right away came to mind the showers in Birkenau that people had to go through. And to our amazement, instead of gas, hot water came from the showers. And then we realized that it was not the end. The German authorities, they sort of set up a little bit of a show place to show the Red Cross personnel that they came to visit, how well they treat their people in their camps. But it was a front. It was just a show.
At this time, and I don't know how my parents got a hold of some papers from Raoul Wallenberg, who was a Swedish diplomat, and he tried to save as many Jews as he could by giving us papers of Swedish citizenships. And he also took us out of the designated Jewish house and brought us over to a different building. This building had a little plaque on the front saying that this is Swedish diplomatic property, in the hope that the Nazis would recognize this. But quite frankly, the Nazis didn't care. They didn't recognize this. If you were a Jew, you had no right to live. The Soviet army is coming up from the east, and the Allies were fighting the Germans from the west. And the Germans pretty much knew that the war was pretty much lost. This is when the deportations have stopped and the death marches out of the camps happened. I'm sure you heard about those. But the killing of the Jews in Budapest did not stop. It was now taken over by the Hungarian Nazi Party. They marched them down to the river Danube. They lined the people up on the banks of the river and they shot them. And we heard the cries and the screams of the people as they realized what was about to happen. We heard the orders being shouted. And then we heard the machine gun fire. And then we all sat there and listened to the silence. They knocked on our door and they told us that tomorrow morning we have to be all lined up in front of the building. And we knew where we were going, and we also knew why. And that was the worst night I ever had in my life. All the women were crying, hugging their children. The men were huddled together praying. And we all hoped that morning would never come, but of course it does, it always does. And very early that morning, we heard rifle butts banging on the front door, and the door had to be opened up. And there stood 2 Soviet soldiers with their submachine guns looking for Germans. The Soviet army took the street we lived on that night. Had there been only 1 day late, I would not be here today to tell you this story. Once liberated, the only plan that we had at that point is try to rebuild our lives. We were starving. My parents tried to go back to the apartment where we used to live, but somebody else was living in there. My parents went on and found another apartment someplace, and we moved in there and started life from scratch.
We saw an American plane being shot down, and this poor pilot was parachuting, and my brother said to me, come on, maybe we can grab him and hide him before the Japs get to him. And he landed, and we got to him, but he was dead. He was full of bullet holes. As he was coming down, the Japanese used him for target practice, and I was crying, and I said to my brother, we got to take him home, we'll make him better, we'll make him better. And it was too late. And then the Filipino said, the Japs are coming, get out of here, get out of here. And I didn't want to. My brother pulled me away. I see his face to this day. I see his face. If only I could have gotten hold of his dog tags, and when we went to America, I could have maybe gotten hold of his parents and told them what a hero he was. He must have been all of 19 years old. And he gave his life. He didn't want to give his life. His life was taken. My oldest brother said to my brother Leon and I, let's go up that church steeple, it's still standing. Maybe we can see what's going on in Manila Bay. You know what we saw, guys? Angels. Angels from America. We're just across the river, the whole 1st Cavalry Division. Thousands of soldiers, all the equipment, and they were crossing. Parents said, no, it'll still be a while. And with that, we hear rumbling. And my mother said, we have to go inside. There was a Japanese tanks ready, trying to leave the area. And we look, and there it is. The most beautiful colors in the world on top of a tank. Red, white, and blue. It was the Yanks. We were free. Nobody was going to kill us. No Jap soldier was going to put a bayonet in us. No one was going to shoot us. No one was going to try to rape my mother. We were free. We were going to go to America. We're coming to America. We escaped the eye of the storm finally.
Liberation is not what Hollywood would have you believe. It's not parades and victorious marches and anything. So somebody in that apartment stepped out, looked around the block, and they saw no one. Somebody who was much more adventurous or courageous then looked down the street, and the Nazis were gone. The first question comes up is, where do I find my next meal? Where do I sleep tonight? So these questions of life is what really liberation is about. A lot of buildings were bombed out. Now, Krakow happened to have been not too badly damaged, so we were lucky in that respect. It was not easy, and as a matter of fact, it was the whole 2 years or year and a half that we stayed in Europe after the war. It was very difficult.
All of a sudden, air raid sirens start to blaze, and they ordered us to go back to the barracks, but it turned out to be the American forces, not the Russian forces. The first reaction was we were very hungry, and right away, regardless what they said, we were looking for food. We were unlucky and we found big boxes of biscuits, so they turned out to be dog biscuits. We didn't read what was in it. It looked to be eaten, you know, and then we saw the writing on it. It was for the SS dogs. They had plenty of dogs around. I lost my younger sister, I lost my mother and my father, that's for sure. But I had 4 other siblings who were much older than me and were in different places. And I was hoping that somebody, at least somebody, 1 or 2 from the family will survive. And that's why I was very anxious to go back to Hungary and try to find them. So I only, at that point, I got united with my sister and with her 2 little nieces. And when I showed up, I remembered the address where she lived. Of course, her house was halfway bombed out. We didn't talk too much. Was very, very sad. I couldn't find not even a picture from my parents or from the family. So till today, I practically don't have a picture from my parents.
What happened was, remember, I came from a large family of about 12 who were left behind. When my dad discovered that my grandparents had survived, and he had sent them airplane tickets, and I don't know why, but for some reason my mother said to my father, "Take Miriam." I guess she wanted me to have that experience of coming to New York and watching my grandparents arrive. Then the next day, we went to Idlewild Airport. LaGuardia had not been built yet. And there was the vision that I will always remember. My grandfather with his Orthodox Hasidic black hat and black coat getting off the plane, and my father waving furiously, and my grandfather getting at the bottom of the steps, taking out his tallis and a prayer book and thanking God and kissing the ground that he had arrived safely in America. We went back to the hotel, and my father was so emotional. He asked me to go home, and he put me on a train and sent me back to Cleveland. He wanted to be alone with his parents. It was a tremendous adjustment for my mother particularly. My father went right to work. He was a very busy man. He was a rabbi at a temple. It was my mother that I definitely remember how difficult it was for her to integrate herself into the typical American housewife mothers of my friends.
The communists did give us a very decent education. But with that education, as I said before, we had the brainwashing. During these political classes, of course, they taught you how great the communist system was. And this is how we, again, had to live and endure. Both my mother and my father had factory jobs. Life for us was pretty, what you could say, normal during the circumstances. Everybody else lived pretty much the same way we did.
My dad joined the Polish government. He was invited. And he made several trips to the West. He had no idea, no understanding of the competition between East and West. The police came in the middle of the night to our house. He was arrested and sent to Siberia. My mother, fearing that the rest of the family would be apprehended and sent to Siberia also, had me with my 20-month-old brother go with the displaced persons towards Trieste, and from there to go take a boat to Palestine before Israel came into existence. My brother, my 20-month-old brother, on my shoulders, and I walked across most of Europe, and he got the measles in Baden, which is about 40 miles south of Vienna. He was taken to the hospital because that was a contagious disease. I would not abandon my brother, so I stayed in this DP camp. And my dad, meanwhile, broke out of prison, out of a Soviet prison, joined my mother, and they went to the West, to Paris to be specific, started looking for us, and finally found us in Baden. We were reunited. We lived in Paris for about 4 or 5 months until we could get transportation to the United States.
Did you already understand the full scope of what would later be called the Holocaust?
My first introduction to what our family had escaped and what it was about was when I was preparing to teach Elie Wiesel's Night. And on page 23 of the original edition, on the bottom of the page, Wiesel says that his train stopped in Kaszów, Slovakia, to Auschwitz. And I went, oh my God, that's me, because I was born in Kaszów. And so I realized that had that been me there in 1944, I would have ended up in Auschwitz. But I was already safe in America, and that's what started me on my quest to find out my own past, ask my parents more about it, study about it, go to Israel, study at Yad Vashem, and got my doctorate eventually in education, and became the Miami-Dade County Public School Holocaust Education Specialist.
I joined the Zionist Youth Movement, and they gave me shelter, a place where to live. And I was going to school to learn a trade in 1948 when Israel became a state. And I was close to army age. I was almost 18 years old. We made it to Israel. And as soon as I got off the boat, I was drafted into the army. I lived in New York since 1956 when I came to the United States to unite with my siblings, all of us. And it was supposed to be a short visit, but I'm still here today.
We arrived by air on American Airlines, I believe February of 1947. And that's pretty much the chronology after the war. And to Miami Beach in 1952. I consider Miami Beach my home.
We were 16 years old already when there was the student uprising in Hungary in 1956. But during this time there was a few days when the borders were very lightly guarded, and that gave us an opportunity to sneak across the border in the dead of night. The opportunity to live in America was everybody's dream. We heard about the freedom, we heard about the opportunities.
Never give up. Never give up. If it seems impossible, it's not impossible. There is always a way to do it, to make a better world, to be a better person, to be kind to each other. And instead of turning away from each other, how about if we start turning towards each other?
I'm very much afraid, so very much afraid, because anti-Semitism didn't stop even with World War II. Today people are much more knowledgeable and more intelligent, and they have so much information. They should seek the truth and not to fall for all kind of conspiracy theories.
There's a Jewish word called mitzvah. It's a good deed. Do the good deed. Be a good person. That's my message to everybody. And I just hope if one person hears and listens and does, I think I've scored real big. I've scored a Babe Ruth home run.
Watch out for anti-Semitism, for hatred, for intolerance. And wherever you see that, you have to stand up, even if you stand alone. Because if you don't, then this can happen again. And if it does happen again, this time it's going to happen to you guys. So you have to be very vigilant and very strong to oppose anything like that.
Get involved in politics. Get to make sure that when you see wrongdoing, call it out, resist in every possible way. Beware. It can happen to you. It could happen now.
So for the future, you should educate yourself and learn more about the event so you won't forget these stories and spread them to other people so they know about these stories.
I learned a lot about persistence. You want to achieve something in life, you just have to put your mind to it, and it doesn't matter where you started, it's just about how you finish.
I've been thinking more closely about how to, see the world around me, how to treat it. If there's any bad actions, I'm kind of like seeking out to prevent it, to kind of help out in the world.